There's so much incredible stuff coming out of your research lab and around the world on the benefits of interval-based training. Now, for all the docs and nutritionists and strength coaches and just avid exercisers in the audience listening, can you give us a bit of a physiology 101 on what exactly is going on during the HIIT training in terms of the energy systems involved, ATP, etc.?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people have this notion. So first point is that interval training comes in lots of different flavors and varieties. And so simply defined, interval training is just periods of relatively intense exercise separated by periods of recovery. That, of course, could be complete rest or lower intensity exercise. And so that impacts a little bit on the energy systems that you use. So if you do interval walking, for example, that's very different from the 1 minute workout, which is very short but very vigorous all-out sprint. So I guess that would be point number one. Point number two is a lot of people think that interval training is largely a quote-unquote anaerobic type of exercise. We think of 400-meter repeats, and that generates a lot of lactic acid and a lot of pain and discomfort. And the sense is that it's not much of an aerobic training stimulus, when in fact it very much is. And so repeated sprints are mainly fueled by aerobic energy provision. So even if you do a single 400-meter repeat, for example, around a track that might take a relatively good individual, maybe 50 or 60 seconds to complete, even during that single hard sprint, probably about 25% of the energy is coming from aerobic metabolism. But if you were to do repeated 400-meter sprints, the vast majority of energy is coming from aerobic metabolism. So viewed in that prism, it's perhaps not surprising that we have such extensive remodeling of the aerobic energy supply system. And what I mean there is the heart becomes a better, stronger pump. The blood vessels get more elastic, which allows blood and oxygen to flow easier. And the muscles get better at using the oxygen. They literally develop and grow more mitochondria, which is the important part of the cell that uses oxygen to burn fuels like sugars and fats.
Terrific. And of course, in terms of measuring fitness, traditionally, aerobic fitness is measured by, VO2 max, and classic aerobic training is how we would build up to improving VO2 max. So can you tell us how, HIIT training relates to, is it possible to improve VO2 max via performing HIIT training? And, is VO2 max a modifiable factor?
Yeah, absolutely. VO2 max is a modifiable factor. Of course, it is defined as the maximum rate at which the body can take up and utilize oxygen, primarily determined by the ability of the heart to deliver oxygen to working muscles. It's a bit like a mortgage. There's a fixed element and a variable component to it. The fixed element largely depends on things like your biological sex and your genetic capacity for adaptation. But there's also a variable element as well, which is largely determined by training state. And so a component of VO2 max is clearly modifiable through training, and we can improve it by exercise training. As you noted, the traditional way to do that is aerobic or traditional endurance type exercise, but we know that intervals can be extremely effective. And so I'm often asked, how does interval training compare to traditional endurance training when it comes to VO2 max or any other parameter for that matter? And I'll often try to reframe the question and say, well, there's two ways to look at it. The apples to apples approach would be if you were to compare a given dose of exercise, so whether that's mechanical work or a given amount of calories expended or a given amount of energy expenditure, but you do that matched work comparison, I think there's pretty compelling data now that interval training will elicit superior benefits. That's certainly the case for VO2 max. A lot of people, of course, are interested in the apples to oranges comparison, which is if we take a relatively small dose of intervals or a small volume of intervals, how does that compare to a much larger dose of the traditional approach? And I think there's good evidence there to suggest that you can see similar benefits, even though the interval training involves less total exercise and less of a time commitment.